I'd like to share with you something of the history of WorshipCentre. It will be a very brief history due to time. In 1999, I was finishing 5 years itinerant ministry in the United States. I'd got to Alaska in a village called Palmer. I was staying in an upstairs room over the church, and we were having a crusade there. I had a visitation of God. It was a tremendous visitation, lasted about 3 days. God spoke to me about many, many things, but amongst it all, He was restoring my life from a deep valley that I'd walked through. Amongst it, He said to me that He'd like me to go home and start another church. I really had a difficulty inside. And He said if I would go home, start a church, He would walk with me through the land one more time. He also said, you'll start a church for another generation. God moved mightily on us, and we came home to Australia, and I was preaching for a man in the Mount Gravatt showgrounds for another ministry. 3 people came up to me in a 24-hour period and said, Clark, we've seen a building that you should buy. We believe it's a place for you to start a church. We hadn't mentioned starting a church to anybody. Anne and I came and looked through the window of this current building late one evening, and I felt God say to me 5 words: I will be with you. On the strength of that, before we'd had a meeting in WorshipCentre, before WorshipCentre was registered even, we bought the building and the land that it's on, and we registered the church, and the following Sunday we had our first meeting. I'd been confessing and believing for 320 people to come to that first meeting. 326 by head count turned up. God moved wonderfully, and another man and I preached for 6 months, 6 nights a week, and we saw God do wonderful things. The rest is pretty much history. Now, in terms of buying the property, was $5,000 down on signing, which I didn't have, but we made up with my credit card. $15,000 in 7 days' time, $30,000 12 days after that, and the balance in 16 weeks. We paid $725,000 for the property. But God said He'd be with us. With the help of a Bank of Queensland towards the end, we bought this property. It's long since fully paid for. God has done a wonderful thing. We learned after we started that Don and Ann Banks, members of our church, were walking on this path somewhere about where I'm standing now. They looked up at the building, and Ann said, I want to go and lay hands on that building, I feel to. So they went and laid hands on the building to claim it for God. And she said, I feel there'll be a great move of God here. About the same time, before ever we bought the building, David Bosky, another minister in town, came and he looked at the building. He was going to relocate his church here. And he said, he was praying about it and said, Lord, is this the building you want for me? And the Lord said to him, this building is not for you, it's for another. I am going to do a mighty work here. He told me that later. God signally had the moving of the Spirit over this building. After He spoke to me in Alaska, I went down to Virginia to Calvary Pentecostal Camp in Ashland. Ruth Heflin was there, a notable prophetess known around the world. And I didn't tell her what I wanted, but I said, Sister Ruth, I've got a great decision to make. I'd like to ask you to ask the Lord for me. Next day she said, Brother Taylor, God said to me that when you go home to Australia, you're to start a church, and the building is already built. It's surrounded by parklands, and of course this building is surrounded by 330 acres of parklands. The signature of God was all over the beginnings of WorshipCentre and has remained over it from that time on. This is not just a church that somebody had a whim to start. but it was instigated by God, and it's been graced by God ever since. God's blessed us abundantly, and I've preached in many places around Australia and overseas since we started this church. There have been many difficulties, and some of them quite severe, but God helped us through every single one of them. God has been good to us, and I want to welcome you into WorshipCentre, a place that God has raised up, that God has anointed, and God has a great destiny for. WorshipCentre is a place of God's choosing, God's building, and God's provision. It's a wonderful place to raise your family and to find your destiny, to grow in the Holy Spirit, in the ways of God. The power of God has been with us from day one to this present time. Now a great team of ministry has come, and the church is largely led by Pastor Skip Smith and his wife Leah. A wonderful couple, and such a fantastic pastoral team has gathered around. The church is solid. A year later, we commenced WorshipCentre in Fiji, we felt by the leading of God. Today there are 17 churches that we started from nothing, and they are flourishing and strong, very healthy, vibrant churches. You would be proud of all of them. WorshipCentre has had a wonderful history. It has a marvellous future, and I trust that you are going to be right into the core of WorshipCentre, that you build your life here, and you let the Spirit of God bless you here, prosper you, lead you into greatness here in this place. WorshipCentre is a significant place for God. I wish WorshipCentre every blessing in God, both now and for future generations. God bless.